ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the history program at NYU Abu Dhabi, it's my special pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the first presentation of our lecture series on how to write global histories this semester, organized in cooperation with the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. My name is Martin Klimke, and I'm the head of the history program here at NYU Abu Dhabi. We are especially delighted to welcome Professor Jeremi Suri from the University of Texas here at Austin tonight. As you certainly know by now, the aim of our series is, on the one hand, to explore the various ways of writing global history by employing perspectives from a plethora of geographical locations. At the same time, however, we'd also like to rethink the traditional routes of writing national narratives by exploring a country's past from a transnational and global perspective. In short, by discovering the global elements of a country's national experience. Professor Suri, whom we have the pleasure of seeing here at NYU Abu Dhabi for the very first time, has been one of the pioneers and leading proponents of this application of global perspectives to the past, in particular in the area of the Cold War and 20th century US history, by analyzing the major political, economic, and cultural forces that shaped the American century and the country's present, and reevaluating the allegedly exceptional elements of US history in relation to networks, identities, and events that transcend the nation-state. Professor Suri holds the Mack Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, with a dual appointment in the Department of History and the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs. He is also a senior fellow at the William P. Clements Jr. Center on History, Strategy, and Statecraft, as well as a distinguished scholar at the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Suri studied at Stanford, Ohio, and Yale University, where he also received his PhD. He was a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison from 2001 to 2011, and from 2009 to 2011, he held the E. Jordan Fox Professorship of History there. He's the author of 5 books on contemporary politics, social movements, and foreign policy, namely Power and Protest, Global Revolution and the Rise of Detente, published by Harvard University Press in 2003, and published as an Arab language and an Indian language edition in 2005. He's also the author of The Global Revolutions of '68, published in 2007, Henry Kissinger and the American Century, published the same year, American Foreign Relations Since 1898, published in 2010, and his latest book is Liberty's Surest Guardian, American Nation Building from the Founders to Obama, published in 2011. He's also the founder and co-editor of the Princeton University Press Scholarly Book Series on America and the World, and has a forthcoming edited volume on foreign policy breakthroughs, cases in successful diplomacy. Professor Suri's articles have appeared in major newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, the Times Literary Supplement, the Boston Globe, and Wired magazine. Professor Suri's lectures widely, and he's a frequent guest on television and radio shows around the world. As a friend of the digital humanities, he also blogs at jeremisuri.net. Professor Suri held distinguished fellowships at the United States Institute for Peace, the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, the Nobel Institute in Oslo, and the Heidelberg Center for American Studies, as well as Hiroshima University, and has received numerous awards for his teaching and writing. In 2007, for example, he was recognized as one of America's top young innovators by Smithsonian Magazine, and in 2012, chosen by Princeton Review as one of the best 300 professors in the United States. In short, he and his works have inspired a whole new generation of historians, myself included, to critically examine popular notions of globalization and revising traditional narratives of US history in the 20th century, highlighting transnational connections, networks, and experiences, and their repercussions on national identity and politics. And as we slowly gear up for yet another US presidential election campaign, we are therefore particularly happy that he could join us tonight and talk about his new book entitled The Reactive Presidency, The Rise and Decline of Presidential Power from FDR to Obama. So without any further ado, I shall now pass the microphone to Professor Suri for what I'm sure will be a very stimulating presentation. Professor Suri, thank you so much for coming. We're very much looking forward to your talk on the rise and decline of the American presidency?
I want to take everyone back to an earlier time. That's what we do as historians. I want to take us back to 2 years that will become obvious to you as I describe them, I hope. And these 2 years involved two presidents you probably know well. One I know you know well, a second one I think you know well in addition. Both of these men entered office during the worst economic downturn in recent memory, not just for Americans, in recent international memory. Two different periods in the 20th century. Periods of over-leveraging, periods of high unemployment, periods of poor distribution of goods and government breakdown in the regulation of labor and capital. Both presidents in these two different periods faced emerging threats abroad, new challengers, new forms of military activity, new forms of irregular warfare used to challenge established powers. Both presidents in these two periods were elected largely because their predecessor had become unpopular. They were both elected as the opposite of their predecessor more than who they were. They were elected because they seemed so different from the others. You realize this if you're not American, it's obvious. We are, as Emerson said, a society that just keeps running around in the same cycle, right? Republican, Democrat, back and forth, right? Both presidents also faced strong opposition. Opposition in Congress, opposition from the Supreme Court, opposition from radio and other media, and both were greeted as popular abroad, but popular for their image, less for what they had done. Popular for their image, less for what they were done. The two presidents I'm referring to, I know you've heard of them both, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933 and Barack Obama in 2009. Now, what's striking to me as a historian is how similar the conditions were for these two men, how similar the challenges they faced, how similar globalization was in the ways it undermined traditional national assumptions of power and wealth in the United States. In both 1933 and 2009, Americans had to grapple with the fact that although they were a rich and wealthy country, they were not a rich and wealthy country that could exist outside the international economy. That the efforts, first of all, to control capital, and then to close off capital for self-protection, neither worked. That the efforts to deregulate and then to re-regulate were not sufficient. That the efforts to pull government out and then to stimulate selectively were not sufficient. In each of these cases, Americans had to confront, in their own words at the time, that they were part of a larger global economy, a larger global society. That's where the similarity ends, however. That's where the similarity ends between these two men. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is one of my favorite photos. There he is with the globe. It's a very American way of thinking about the world, right? President and the globe. Note the old telephone. I've had students ask me what that is. I have no idea. And I tell them he wasn't tempted to look at his iPhone while I was speaking, right? In case any of you might be tempted. And here we have President Obama, right? His recent trip to India. First president, I'll come back to this, first president in American history to travel to India twice. And it's not just India, it's the distance. He's traveled twice. This man inherited challenges that were greater than Obama's. As bad as things looked in 2008, as great as the challenges were in an age of terror and an age of economic downturn, they were nothing like what Franklin Roosevelt confronted in 1933. In 1933, people believed across the world, from this region to others, that capitalism was on its way down. There was almost a universal belief. Capitalism had failed. It had failed to produce wealth. It had produced now a cycle of despair, of deflation, which is, as everyone knows, worse than inflation. Where prices go down, people are laid off from work, less is produced, and the economy grinds to a halt. It was also a period when the most popular man in the world was a man named Adolf Hitler. Joachim Fest, the great German historian of Hitler, has written that in 1936, if Hitler had died suddenly, he would have been treated as the great man of the decade. fascism seemed to offer an alternative, and it did for many in this region as well. Many nationalist activists in the Middle East looked to Germany, looked to the fascist model as an alternative to deal with the problems of capitalism. Franklin Roosevelt inherited a weak presidency in a time of great difficulty. His staff, believe it or not, was less than 10. He had less than 10 people who worked for him. Can you believe that? Martin has more than 10 people who work for him. Franklin Roosevelt had an incredibly small budget. This is my favorite factoid. If you forget everything else I say, just remember this. When Franklin Roosevelt was president, he still collected an allowance from his mother. The presidential salary was so small, and his taste in fine cigarettes was so great that he needed his mama's money to pay. Executive authority over the society and economy was minimal. Expectations were low. There was no social welfare state in the United States in 1933. There was no federal funding of education. Every major research university you have visited in the United States, the largest source of cash for that, including NYU, outside of tuition, the largest source of cash is federal funding through research and financial aid. None of that existed. That's why NYU looked so different at the time. None of that existed at this time. This man took a small presidency with a small number of people, and he transformed the world. He transformed American society. This man has a staff in the thousands. In the thousands. In fact, his staff is so large, there is no number. I have spent years trying to pin down a number, and there is no fixed number, because he has a White House staff, then he has people he requisitions from the State Department, people he requisitions from the Defense Department, and then he has agencies that refuse to admit they even exist, let alone tell me how many people work for them. So you can't even count the number of staff members. He does not know all the staff members he has. His budget is in the billions, of course, trillions if you include defense spending. But of course, he can just print more. He can just print more money. That's how the stimulus was handled in the United States. We're the only country that can just print money, and people will take it. People will actually pay us to hold their money. We'll pay negative interest rates in 2009 and still bring money in. He has executive authority over a range of issues, from who gets admitted to college, through affirmative action policies, through how stimulus money and taxation operates in the economy, marginal tax rates, through regulations on health, regulations on immigration, regulations on the fuel efficiency of cars. He commands the largest military in the world, so large that it is larger than the next 10 combined. He commands that. He is the most powerful person, certainly we have seen in centuries, and every successive administration is more powerful. Here's the paradox I want to talk about tonight. How is it that this man could be so much less powerful and achieve so much more? How is it that this man could be so much more powerful and achieve so much less? Now, this is not a criticism of Obama. I'll lay my cards on the table. I don't think he's a bad president. I don't think he's a great president. This is not about Obama personally, nor is it about this man personally. It's about the changes in the presidency. We study global history because the words we use in English or in Arabic or in French or in German, they appear to be static, but they change in meaning as global historical forces change their application on a daily basis. So the president we talk about, it sounds like it's the same president, but it's a different one. Not just different in personality, different in office, different in the effects of his power, different in what he does. And we fail as scholars and as citizens when we maintain an old image for a new office, or when we assume the individual controls the office. It is the office and the circumstances that deeply influence the power and effectiveness of the individual, which is to say, it matters less who is president than what the presidency is. It matters less who is president than what the presidency is. And I like to draw a contrast with this man for that purpose. Everyone knows who this is, right? Anybody know who this is? Emily, who is this? This is George Washington, right? He's on dollar bills, right? George Washington, right? He is the first American president, of course. George Washington created the mold. As scholars generally agree, the most creative act of America's founders was to create the presidency. There would never been an institution like it before. The presidency, in the words of one scholar, is designed to be highly democratic and highly regal at the same time. Highly democratic and highly regal at the same time. And think about the powers of the president. He has the power to act as commander-in-chief. He has the power to veto legislation. He has the power to pardon people. He can pardon someone of a crime. These are traditional regal positions. But most of all, unlike parliamentary systems, the founders of the United States wanted the president to be able to be a symbol for all the people, to be a unifying figure. This is always the justification for royalty, that the royal sovereign manifests the whole country, brings people together. But at the same time, this office was intensely democratic. The president had almost no staff, intentionally. The president had to rely on Congress for his budget, intentionally. The president was dependent upon both Congress and the Supreme Court to say anything he did was okay and legal. And most significant of all, most significant, the president did not order anyone around. He was symbolic, and his power came from his ability to bring people together, his ability to manifest the nation as a royal figure, but in a way that was democratically connected to institutions of election, including his own. We have come very far from this world. We have come very far. And we have come far not because anyone decided we should come far, but because of the nature of American power and what that has done to the American presidency. My argument tonight is that the presidency has grown too large. The presidency has grown too big. American presidents are doing too much. And this is, in fact, making them less able to do their job. That the office is too large for a human being, and that the historical development of the office has undermined its purposes. And I will say as an aside, I think this is exactly the role that historians and that global history should play. Not telling us on detail how to conduct policy tomorrow. We shouldn't pretend we're policymakers. But allowing us to see how the words we use have come to mean different things from what we mean, and how institutions that we've inherited have changed before our eyes. Changed in ways that we see as normal, but ways we might want to question. Ways we might want to question. Now, why do I think this is the case? Why do I make such a bold statement about my president? I gave this speech at the State Department a little while ago, and there were many people in the White House you could imagine who were not happy with this argument, right? Some would say the president should be even more powerful, right? Some would say he should do even more. Well, I think we can see this in where I started, where smaller seems to produce more, and larger has repeatedly produced less. Let me put it very succinctly. For the past 30 years, we've had an ever more powerful president, and I think it's hard to make the case we've had ever better results in foreign policy or domestic policy. I think quite the contrary. What's happened is that an overly powerful president doing too many things has become tactically brilliant, but strategically devoid of purpose. Presidents spend their time solving too many problems, addressing too many issues, and not focusing on the things that count. We have an office that is hyperactive, an office that is hyperreactive, an office that is not dealing with the priorities that were outlined when the founders thought about this man. The presidency is designed to address big strategic issues, to think about long-term value for a society, not about chasing terrorists around the world, not about solving the problems of local communities, as important as those are. And it's incumbent upon us as scholars of history to see that change and recognize it and react to it rather than pretend it's not there. So I'm not going to necessarily propose the solutions today as I talk some more about this, though I'm happy to talk about the solutions. I have ideas. I think in a history lecture series we want to identify the problem. We want to identify the shifts around us. So let me say a lot more about that. I hope you have the patience for me to say a lot more about that. Let me begin with some of the historiography on the presidency. One of the things historians do is we analyze and reanalyze issues. People often ask me, why do you keep writing history books? Haven't you written all the history at some point? Is there anything more to say? I say only Martin Klimka has written all the history so far. The reason we keep writing history is because we see the issues anew. We see them in different ways. For a long time, the conventional position was that the presidency had grown as a necessary function for the problems American society faced, beginning with Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, through the Great Depression and World War II. The argument here was that a strong presidency was necessary to deal with modern problems that only a president could solve. Modern problems that only a president could solve. A contrary scholarship grew up in the 1970s during the oil crisis. The oil crisis is underrated in 1971 through 73. It's underrated in its effects upon the United States and its conceptualization of itself. Scholarship that grew up in that period argued that the presidency had become too powerful, too close to certain regimes and certain commodities overseas, that the imperial presidency, in the words of one historian, had sold out the United States to Saudi sheikhs. Maybe so. That the American presidency had become imperial rather than democratic. And that actually, for the 1970s and 80s, was the main way historians viewed these issues as well, that it was too strong and too imperial. Then came a new group of scholars in the 1990s, around the same time Martin and I were starting out, who wrote that the president was less exceptional, that the presidency was just like other offices overseas, and that as we understood the presidency, we should understand large power, and that the president isn't that different from a prime minister, isn't that different, perhaps, from a dictator in many, many ways. I think all of these are unfounded. I think fundamentally, when you look at it, the office of the presidency today is something quite unique, not better, quite unique, and quite unique in the challenges it has confronted, quite unique in the ways it has created debilitating difficulties for American policy making. And let me make that and explain that argument to you. It has, I think, three elements to it. I will narrate them for you, and then I will show you some of the evidence. This is why I like PowerPoint. I don't think you should use PowerPoint to put words up. You should use PowerPoint to put up evidence. And we as historians use evidence. So I'm going to walk you through the argument, and then I'm going to put up some of the evidence for you. First problem the presidency has developed. And you actually see it here, is that the president is a national institution with global aspirations. A national institution with global aspirations, but still rooted in a nationalist political framework. Presidents are elected primarily for domestic issues in the United States. I think every political scientist believes that. It's very rare that foreign policy is a major issue. Those of you who lived through the Iraq War, I'm sure you know this. President George W. Bush will be remembered for the Iraq War, probably not remembered well for the Iraq War, but he was elected in an election in 2000 where he said absolutely nothing about foreign policy. In fact, the one thing he said about foreign policy is that we should not do nation building. So much for campaigns predicting one's policies. The campaign was entirely about domestic issues, as has both of Obama's elections, and as will the next election in the United States. They will be about domestic issues. The institution is rooted in a nationalist legitimacy and a nationalist sensibility, yet its greatest impact is in many ways international. Its greatest impact is in many ways international. It is a global institution as no other is. The president is the only person in the world now who can decide that someone should die and actually seek to kill them within 24 hours and do it. We call those drone strikes. The presidency is the only institution in the world that commands military forces in virtually every country and certainly every region of the world. Commands those forces and then reports to Congress thereafter. The presidency is the only institution in the world that regularly will make decisions about millions of dollars in foreign aid, millions of dollars to multiple entities, beyond what even the richest of individual donors or other donor countries can do. The United States gives a lower proportion of its GNP to foreign aid than most countries, and we should be embarrassed by that, but our GNP is so large that the total amount of foreign aid we give is still gargantuan. And if you think that's wrong, look at what American foreign aid has done in Israel and Egypt, two of the largest traditional recipients of American foreign aid. The Israel and Egypt we see today have been largely made by American foreign aid. And it's interesting to watch, to me, we can talk more about this, al-Sisi's relationship with Obama along these lines, just as it's interesting to look at Netanyahu's in these terms. The presidency is operating on a global scale that was unthinkable even 20 to 30 years ago, with a speed, an accuracy, and a determination that's hard to find parallels for, and way outside the constitutional imagination of those who thought about the creation of a presidency. So that's one big shift that's occurred. The second is the nature of the administrative state that has grown up since 1945 to support this. 1945 is an interesting breaking point because it's after 1945 that three big shifts occur. Three big shifts after 1945. Number one, the creation of a national security state with new institutions for the president to manage on a day-to-day basis military forces. It's 1947 that the United States creates the so-called National Security Act, which has the National Security Council, the CIA, and a joint military force in the Pentagon created. The founders, these guys, expected that the Army and Navy should be small, they should not exist in peacetime in any large number, and they should be separate. They didn't trust the president to have control over the military at one time. The opposite is the case. In addition to the military-industrial complex, you get a global legal enforcement regime. People forget this. It's the United States that is instrumental in creating the United Nations, creating many of the international institutions that provide a basis for international law. International law that the United States will often break itself, but international law that the United States will use to structure relations with other societies. And one thing I've written about in a recent book is to see how institutions in other societies come to look more and more American in their legal structure and their economic activities after 1945 as a consequence of the international, basically, incentives that are created. And the best example of this is actually global education. Universities in different societies look very different from one another in the way they structured degrees, in the way they structured course development, in the way they structured faculty and tenure. Before 1945, they actually come to a sort of unified way of operating, closely unified by the point we're at right now. And the third area where we see this administrative state is in the growth of staff, in the growth of people around the presidency. And that's another point I want to emphasize, the role of bureaucracy. The role of bureaucracy, the number of people and the number of complex actors around the presidency. All of these are seen in some, I think, very vivid evidence that historians have not used enough of. And these are called calendars. Now, this is also funny. Well, maybe it's funny, maybe it's not. We'll see. My students don't know what these are either. They've never kept a calendar on paper, right? They have no, I mean, why would anyone do this? Why didn't FDR have an iPhone and just sort of put it there? This is Franklin Roosevelt's calendar. This is the day after the Pearl Harbor attack. That's his day, ladies and gentlemen. That's what he did. There it is there. This was kept by his secretary, Missy LeHand, and by his valet. And you can see they just wrote stuff in. That's when he delivers the war message, the last time the United States declared war. Right? And he has lunch, rests a little bit, right? Meets with a few people, right? And I mean, they have enough room here they can put Mrs. Roosevelt's schedule. What's interesting is how infrequently Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt's schedules overlap when you're looking at these things. No one had a day like that today, did they? Most of you probably did a lot more stuff, didn't you? Most of you sat through a lot more meetings, right? That's what the presidency looked like. The day after Pearl Harbor, the day the United States goes to war, the day that will live in infamy. Now let me show you one day in Lyndon Johnson's life. And in fact, all you have here is his morning. Notice first how the calendar is kept. It's more technical now. It's more technocratic. Precise times, because every minute matters. Some of you might have calendars like this, right? And one meeting after another. Now, what's really interesting about Lyndon Johnson, one could go on forever telling stories about President Lyndon Johnson. Many of these people would never leave his office because they'd come into the Oval and then someone else comes in or someone else is on the telephone and they never leave. They spend the whole day sitting there. But beyond that, right, he doesn't have any downtime in here. And this is just the morning. One could go on and on. Number of average daily meetings. Number of average daily meetings. We just plotted this across time here, right? Look at how much busier the days become. Here's the one I really want you to look at. So Lyndon Johnson is an outlier by far. And anyone who knows the history of Lyndon Johnson knows that. But look at the trend here. It's the same in our lives. It's the same in our own lives. Many of the meetings are short. Now, I don't know about you, I've never really done any strategic thinking with anyone in a 15-minute meeting. But look at the range of these meetings, right? Look at what's happening. Many more shorter meetings. And here's just a quick comparison between Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan. Now, a few people would say Ronald Reagan was a particularly hard-working president. Few people identify Ronald Reagan as a man who was excessively detail-focused. So it's actually a good comparison. This man created the post-war international architecture. Just a few things he did: the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO, the creation of the Baghdad Pact, or it's created by Eisenhower, but the beginnings of it happened with Truman, the creation of what becomes Americans' Foreign Aid Point 4 plan, the articulation of the containment doctrine. If you were talking about the Cold War, most of the action occurs here. This man came a long time after, and look at the difference in his day. Now, I use these graphs not because I think quantitative approaches to history prove anything. That's not my point. My point is to say that these calendars tell us a lot more than we're willing to give them credit for. When we look at policies in isolation, we don't see what the leader is actually experiencing. When we follow their day, we understand what they're doing a lot better. And let me say a few things to compare these now. So what you see in Franklin Roosevelt's day is you see Roosevelt meeting with a discrete number of people, but a diverse range of people. The Russian ambassador, Maxim Litvinov, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, the mayor of New York. That's a really interesting one, right? He's interested in public opinion. How are people reacting in New York to these issues? He has a lot of time to think. He typically would spend his morning alone or with his few closest advisors. He has a lot of time to think, and he is not pressured. You see this in his calendar day after day. He is not pressured to solve every problem happening in every place. Sometimes this has horrible effects. Roosevelt doesn't have meetings about the Holocaust because he doesn't think it's his job to save Jews. It's his job to win World War II. He doesn't have meetings about the regulation of a particular industry. He doesn't think that's his job. He doesn't have meetings about higher education. He doesn't think that's his job. Maybe those things should have been his job. But what he has is a day where he can focus on what he sees as the key issues the country faces. And he spends his time formulating his ideas with a close group and then working to bring people in, key opinion leaders. Lyndon Johnson's day is filled with short meetings addressing one problem after another. What Lyndon Johnson does, probably more rapidly, but similarly to most presidents, certainly similar to Obama, is to deal with one problem after another and put one Band-Aid on after another. And those of you who have read the history of the Vietnam War know why I put up this day. This is the day American forces, conventional land forces, are landed for the first time in Vietnam in a combat role in Da Nang in March of 1965. But you read Johnson's calendar, and there's no thought in that. It's a reaction. And he will continue to react once again to the next threat, and the next threat, and the next threat. It's what I call the security approach we've adopted in the war on terror. I call it the TSA approach, the Transportation Security Authority. If you've gone through American airports, you've experienced this, right? And it basically says this: if there's a problem, we'll just send more people on it. More people to make you take your shoes off. More people to look through your luggage. More money and more people to be sent after a problem. So here, there is a real decision about how to think about the war, how to tell the American public and the world what the war is, and how to mobilize capital, resources, and people behind the war. Here, there's no decision about that in Vietnam. There's a problem of an attack on an American air base, and there's a need to respond. There's a need to respond. And people are asked to follow along because the problem is there and we must react. The element of leadership that has fallen out from a larger, more powerful president is the leading. The ability to see beyond the problem of the moment, the ability to see to the larger issues, the ability to think through before acting. George Kennan put it best in 1947. The United States sometimes looks like a giant dinosaur with a pinhead brain rumbling around the jungle. Rumbling around the jungle. And that is an unfair characterization, but it's not an entirely misplaced categorization. Presidents spend their time surrounded by domestic advisors. This is a word cloud. I like playing with this stuff, as you can see. This is a word cloud. The larger the name, the more you've met with the president, and that's where power is, right? All three people for Reagan at this time are domestic policy advisors. Baker later becomes Secretary of State. He's chief of staff at this time, and Meese and Deaver are Reagan's buddies from California. He's making policy largely on domestic grounds for international issues. On domestic grounds for international issues. And presidents take less time to think. It's not that they aren't working hard. Their vacation time, like most Americans, goes away. I mean, I love the fact that look how much vacation Truman takes. I feel so empowered by that. I never take vacation. When my wife keeps saying, if Truman could take vacation, so should you, right? Look at look at what happens here. It falls off. It falls off. There's no time to think. There's no time to analyze the larger problems around you. That takes us back to the present. What's striking about the modern American president, to me, more than anything else, is all the symbolism of power, all the influence around him, but the difficulties in their own eyes of actually getting things done. What jumps out in the archives is the phrase, "I am frustrated." The difficulty of getting these issues through, as powerful as one is. And let's now talk for a few minutes about Obama, who you're probably most interested in. So he flies on Air Force One, his own aircraft filled with his people somewhere. He gets off of Air Force One. He gets into one of six armored vehicles that fly with him in a C-130 plane wherever he goes. He is surrounded by no less than 300 to 500 people providing security and advice to him on a daily basis. He goes into a place, meets with people in pre-scripted meetings, has the pre-scripted discussion, goes to a pre-scripted dinner, then returns to his secure, isolated hotel, and then flies to the next place. It is difficult for presidents in those circumstances, whether Democrat or Republican, whether populist or elitist, it's difficult for them to know where they are visiting, where they are, what are they doing, and difficult for them to figure out what their priorities should be. They are managed and they are reactive. They are not strategic. And this opens up three final points that I want to put on the table. These are points for research, right? We're a research institution. These are points for research for us. How do we recognize and understand the ways in which these global constraints could work differently? What are the alternatives to a president that has to have a global role but could operate differently? Is security really making it a necessity for the president to be so isolated? Does the president really have to react as quick as he does? The larger research question here is about speed. Everyone says change is happening faster, but are we making it faster? My argument is that what you see here is not that Lyndon Johnson has a faster world around him. He's making it go faster. The structure of the presidency is making that happen. FDR is slowing it down so he can make better decisions. So what are the forces making things go faster, and what is the role of the individual to slow things down? When is leadership about doing less? Is the historical question we have to ask ourselves. No leaders say that today, but it's really true. Second question, how should an electoral system choose leaders to operate more effectively? How can a system that bases its decisions on short statements of domestic policy produce someone to operate effectively in this area? How can we rethink that? No one would want to throw away a democratic system, but is there a better way? Is there a better way? It seems to me a system dominated by a few moneymakers who have monetary interests, that's always been there, but it seems to be larger than ever before, and dominated by primaries in particular states that choose people for the interests of those small states to be the nominees of their party, is pulling us farther and farther away from the global demands on the office. Mario Cuomo, former governor of New York, famously said, and I love this phrase, "You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose." You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. I put it a different way. You campaign in the poetry of the American man on the street, but to govern in the prose of the international system and what NYU Abu Dhabi is about. But we choose presidents who would never feel comfortable in this environment. We choose presidents, in fact, because they're not of this environment. Why is that? How could that change? What are the research alternatives from comparative studies of democracy? I would love to see more work being done on that right here, right here. And third, what are the ways in which international leadership can be conducted that are not so individual focused? Why does it have to be such a powerful presidency? I was saying this before to some colleagues in the hallway. The man who created this office would never recognize it today. Would never recognize it today. Look at the way they depict themselves. This is a famous portrait by Gilbert Stuart, right? The president has a sword, yes, but he doesn't have a huge army behind him. And the president is a philosopher. The president is a philosopher. He's a man of honor. He's a man of philosophy. He's a man of thought, right? He is a philosophical person. The references to Greece and Rome are overwhelming here. Even though this man was a general, he's not wearing the general's uniform. Even though this man is the chief executive of the United States, he does not have bureaucrats around him. He is a thinker. He is an individual operating within a larger system. Does an all-powerful presidency really produce better results? Can you have leadership with a less powerful individual? Are there collective alternatives? These are also issues that deserve more study. This office was unique in its time. It's unique in its time today, and it needs a new uniqueness for a new time. So my final points then, that I hope we can talk about some more, are not questions about whether we should have one kind of president or another. My argument is that we spend too much time arguing over differences that are actually less significant than they seem. The real question is about the structure of the office. And we have failed when we look at the individual without studying the office and the context. That's what history is all about, the context and the institution. And if we look at the context and the institution, we see that the context has become more global and more bureaucratic, and the institution has become more rigid, more isolated, and more debilitated in its ability to react effectively for larger strategic purpose. That what we have is a United States dominated by a president that pursues tactical goals, often forgetting what its larger strategic purposes should be. And that the solution to this, which I haven't told you much about yet, but we can talk about if you want, the solution would be to reform the office, not just to elect new people to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that talk. It's probably, I think, my humble opinion, the best talk I've heard here this season.
It'll only get better, I'm sure. Don't worry.
Okay. Well, that's what I'd like you to do at this point. Obviously, you've left the door open here to talk about what suggestions you have to try to make the presidency more effective, more, as you were talking about, less nitpicky, as it were, and more strategic, more overall. As sort of a precursor to this, to your reply, I would like to quote what Jesse Ventura said, the former governor of Minnesota, who said, you know, when he was elected to office, he said, I had all these ideas about how I was going to change the government, about how I wanted to run things. But I soon found that I was standing in front of this millstone that was turning, and all I could do, I would try to put my hand up to try to stop it, but I realized all that was going to happen was I was going to get crushed. And all you can do is sort of step out of the way. Isn't this what has become with the presidency? How can any one man stand up to this millstone?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a great analogy, and I rarely agree with Jesse Ventura. But in this case, I agree with Jesse Ventura. That's what every president goes through. I mean, you couldn't have been a president who wanted to stand up against the millstone more than President Obama. And someone who, by the way, had all the intellectual skills. I mean, the person who's been president in the last 50 years who's most like those of us who are intellectuals is Barack Obama. And it's humbling. So the solution is clearly not put more intellectuals in there. In fact, I think more intellectuals in office will make things worse. That's not the argument. That's not the argument at all I'm trying to make. It's a very difficult thing to think through. So I have three solutions I'm offering, but the reason the book is not done is because I haven't come up with satisfactory solutions, and I promised my publisher I would. They want to sell the book, not just depress people, right? But here are the three things I want to put out there, and you guys can tell me what works and what doesn't, you think. One has to do with the calendars themselves. I think we need to be conscious of how we're using time. And presidents, leaders, and I say this to people when I lecture to CEOs, they need to stop speeding up time and actually slow it down. You need to be conscious about slowing down and creating deliberative space during the day. And the best leaders I've met do that, right? Find a way to make the government deliberative. Don't just go meeting to meeting and issue to issue. And you have to find a way publicly to provide yourself cover on that. So sometimes you have to actually manipulate and lie. That's what Roosevelt did. Roosevelt famously said, right? I am a juggler. This is his quote. I am a juggler. Sometimes my right hand does something and my left hand doesn't know it's doing it, right? Roosevelt lied to the American public in 1939-40s. He's preparing for war and we have neutrality legislation. I'm not arguing for lying per se, but I'm arguing you've got to make the public think you're doing more sometimes than you are so you can focus on what really counts. And slow things down. Don't always speed them up. Speed is not necessarily advantageous. I have a 10-year-old son. I've never convinced him that speed is not advantageous. But slow down sometimes. That's one. Still hard to do. I don't know how much that helps. That's one. Two, I think it's really important for presidents to get out of the bubble. They have to get out of the bubble. And simply traveling with thousands of people on your own aircraft and in armor-plated limousines is not the way to do that. Let me give you an example from my own experience. I was telling Emily about this before. President Obama, President Clinton, President Carter, and President Bush, George W. Bush, all came to the University of Texas last year to see me. No, not to see me. They came for the anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And it was qualitatively different with Obama than the other three. They all had security. Obama, they closed the campus for him. They closed the campus. He drove, or his people drove his armored limousine up to the building so he could just get out and go right in so no one could see him until he was in the building, right? This level of security and the level of barrier between him and everyone. So he came to the university, but was he really there? Did he really get a feel for what was going on? Did he really talk to a student? Did he get any sense of what it was like to be a student? No, not at all. You've got to get out of the bubble. We cannot be so obsessed with security that we debilitate the ability of the president or whoever's making decisions to actually understand the world they're acting in. And I don't know exactly how we do that, but part of the obsession with security is something we have to, as Americans, get rid of a little bit, it seems to me, right? Third thing, right? So we've got slow things down, get out of the bubble. Third thing, I think presidents need to pick advisors who are willing to think in strategic terms, not advisors who serve their political purposes alone. Too much of that is done. And it's become worse and worse because there's more pressure for everything to be about politics. Now, I understand why they do that. I talked to people on Obama's staff, and they said, well, we're always in campaign mode because we've always got a campaign to run. Well, maybe that's not the right way to think about it. I've longed for someone who actually wants to be in office and who is not certain they want to run again. It might be a better thing. I'm against term limits because I think sometimes you get someone in office who's very good and might want to stay, and that might be a good thing, and you might not have someone better. But I'm also against the presumption that everyone who's in office immediately should be thinking about getting reelected. And I think electing, seriously, people who really aren't sure they want that second term might help us, because then they're not always campaigning for their second term. So those are my three solutions right now, but I'm not satisfied with them. That's why I haven't finished the book. So help me.
Hello, thank you. To what extent do you think that this overloading of presidential power comes from the separation of powers itself? And do you think that a move towards a system like Britain that has the executive as part of the legislative would help?
Right, so this is a great question. Is this a function of what is a unique American thing also, the separation of power, where we have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary as separate bodies? And in a sense, they check one another. Of course, the British system is different. The prime minister comes out of the parliament, and that's true for most governments, right? I think the vast majority of democracies are parliamentary democracies. Woodrow Wilson believed that the presidency should be more like a parliamentary system. and I was saying this before the lecture to a few people, between Thomas Jefferson's time, between 1808 and 1912, the president never gave the State of the Union address at Congress. He just sent it, and someone read it, and no one paid any attention. Woodrow Wilson starts going and giving the address to make the president more of a parliamentary leader, more of a legislative leader. So we've moved in that direction to some extent. But I actually think we've had not enough separation of powers. That's a strange thing to say when Congress and the presidency are like this. But separation of powers doesn't mean partisan squabbling. Separation of powers means that there is an effort to build consensus among the different institutions. And what's happened now is the presidency has actually moved into space that neither Congress nor the judiciary actually can act in. And I think that's created some of this problem. I think more discussion, more transparency, and more forced cooperation would actually produce better results. In the short run, presidents don't want that. It makes it harder. They think they can be more effective without it. So war is the best example of this. The last time the United States declared war, December of 1941. So in legal terms, we haven't been at war since then. Now, that's, of course, nonsense, right? Now presidents react to an issue. They might get a congressional enabling resolution. They don't get a declaration of war. They send the troops and then tell Congress to send the money. That makes it too easy to send forces, it seems to me. And that's a violation, I think, of separation of powers. So I'd like to see more separation of powers.
Hi, I think I'd like to pinpoint what you said about time and reacting. But it seems to me that even if the American presidency is reformed to slow down time, this won't be enough given the global political situation. And I think of this in terms of Europe, for example. I'm Greek and I was in parliament and government for 10 years. And I see now that too many people are talking, there's too much pressure to answer every question, every leader, even in a collective form of leadership, which you alluded to, there are these problems. Have you at all considered that perhaps the paradigm shift should be of the global political system addressing this pressure of time?
Wow, that would be great. I don't know how we could do that, but that would be great.
But still, if the U.S., for example, slows down to have more meaningful, still the pressures are great.
I agree with you. I agree. It's interesting, and you said you're from Greece, so I'm glad you brought this up. So Yanis Varoufakis, who's now your foreign minister, he was one of my faculty colleagues for a while. Finance minister. What did I say? Foreign finance minister. So he was a professor of economics at the University of Texas, one of my colleagues. A wonderful teacher, by the way, and good drinker also. So Yanis and I talked about this a lot. It's interesting. And his view was what was going on in Europe is exactly what you were saying, that the Greeks were getting rolled into a system that was moving very fast, that people weren't sitting back and looking and understanding in his terms all the bad things the Germans were doing. That's his view. That's his view of it. And he's putting that into practice now. I think you're right. I think part of it is the way the global system operates now, and it's not really about media, right? It's about the way capital and other resources are moved very quickly without thinking through the consequences, and the regulatory bodies are slow to catch up with them. I think that is a real problem, but the only way I can see starting to address that is not through the United Nations. It's through the big actors starting to change the game. And unlike Greece, the United States is in a position to make, we don't dominate the system fully, but we're in a position to make a huge difference. And so I'd like to see us play a leader in that, but that's only the first step, I think.
Okay, thank you. Just focusing a little bit more on your third point that you said, moving away from necessarily the individual but the office, and looking from an outside, obviously not American.
Sure.
Has the office not sold its soul, literally, to the wealth power brokers? Even just demonstrated by the cost of a campaign.
Yeah.
Who's in charge, really?
Well, there's a lot to what you're saying. There's too much money in American politics. There's always been too much money in American politics, but now there's even more money than there was before. And I will tell you, the biggest impediment to good people running for office is they don't think they can raise enough money. And that's a terrible system. And I think we've had some bad Supreme Court decisions on this. We should have limits on how much people can spend. They can be reasonable limits. And we should have ways of helping people finance campaigns if they have good ideas, but they aren't wealthy or they don't have wealthy supporters. So it is a problem. Again, it's always been there, but the scale of the problem is worse. I don't think the office has sold its soul, because I'll tell you, and maybe I'm too influenced by the inside view, but there are so many good people who go into the office. I mean, that's what I'm really trying to get at. It's not about the people, it's about the structure of activities. So the office has not sold its soul, because most of the people who go work for the executive, they're not wealthy, they're young people, they're students. And others who go and work in this role do an exceptional amount of work out of idealistic purposes at very low pay. So it's not that they are the money brokers. It's not the office internally. It's the way the office sits in relationship to the money outside of it. And that's the problem right there. And it's the ways in which those within the office don't understand what they should be doing. So I don't think the office has sold its soul. I think, in a more deeper sense, American voters have sold their souls. American voters are voting for people who are doing things that more often than not are not serving their own interests. That's not the office, that's the system, right? And that sounds like a very elitist thing to say. I'm not saying voters are bad people. I'm saying voters don't understand, because we have not helped them to understand what is actually going on. We have failed as historians. They don't understand how the presidency works. How can we expect them to elect the right people for that office? And that's where education is a really important component. And if I can put in one more plug for liberal arts, where else are they going to learn that but by studying history and philosophy and literature? The last time I looked, there's no quantitative way to predict who's going to be a good president. But there are historical ways to understand the differences across administrations. And I think that's a really important part of what we should be doing.
So it's fitting that you just mentioned liberal arts, because I can't help but think about the books that you had us read in the humanities.
Did you read them?
War and Peace, yes. And I'm also thinking of Clausewitz and the Fog of War, because something that you told us is that in order to think strategically and wisely, you have to be able to rise above the fog of war and already have really a framework in place for how you're going to navigate that. So I just want to ask a question just based on my optimism that there are amazing people in the government having that space and time to think through these things and to navigate the fog of war. In your research, in the many institutions in the US government, where is that space? Where are people thinking strategically? Where are people thinking through all the different ramifications and rising above the fog of war and making good decisions? Where, if it's not the presidency right now, where is that space?
I think it's a great question, Emily. I think there's a lot of that going on in places like the policy planning staff at the State Department, in the Planning Bureau, at the Defense Department, in the Treasury Department. Within all of these institutions, there are people with good ideas, and there are people who want to bring these ideas to fruition. They tend to be 1 or 2 levels below the assistant secretaries, or 1 or 2 levels below what would be a dean at a university. And the problem is they're squashed, no one listens to them, and then in order to make their way up, they are forced to actually get into the fog of war more and to be less threatening to the institution. And so now here we come back to the 60s that Martin and I have written about. One of the great insights from the 1960s is that you have to have a long march to the institutions, but the institutions have to be willing to take risks on people who are younger, who have different ideas. Another way of coming back to your question about the soul of the executive is you could say Americans have fundamentally become too conservative about the way they seek power. To be non-strategic is simply to try to run in place and deal with all the problems, put your finger in all the holes in the dike, rather than taking some risks, rather than looking to some younger people who have new ideas. The best universities are not dominated by deans, they're dominated by young, and I include myself in the young faculty. The best institutions are not dominated by older people. The older people play a role, but they're dominated by young people who have new ideas. And here's the statistic that's actually most depressing then. You have all these young people in offices like the State Department, the Defense Department, and elsewhere. The average age for American senators is well above 65. The average senator is a multimillionaire, comes to the point about money, and well above 65. That's not the way you would run a country or a company, and it shouldn't be the way we run the United States.